Hi, I'm Tori Womack, and I did my Educational Giant project on Paulo Freire. And I'm not totally sure how to pronounce his last name, so I'm just going to call him Paulo for the rest of the presentation. So Paulo was a Brazilian philosopher and educationalist, and during the late 20th century, he was widely known as the most influential thinker on education. And he had this belief that towards education, that he thought that this education system was kind of like an act of subjection and of repression, and he just had like this negative attitude towards it, and so he wanted to change it. And so then he believed that education should be more of a system of like liberation and of freedom, and just focus on that. So that was his overall like goal and wants in life. But so to start off his biography, so Paulo was born on September 19th, 1921, and he was born in Recife, Brazil. And growing up, his family, they suffered the effects of like the Great Depression, and they lived in poverty, and then they were suffering from starvation and things like that. And so part of that, he didn't have an education. He didn't have the opportunity to receive an education. And so his hardships that he went through as a kid, they helped to shape his opinion towards education, like as he got older. And it made him have the desire to create a new system and to want to help out the poor, because when he was in poverty, he didn't have the education. He wanted to help those who were in the same situation as him so that they can learn how to read and how to write. And so that's what he wanted to do. So later on in his life, in 1943, he ended up going to law school, and he studied philosophy and the psychology of language and things like that. But he ended up not going into law. He went into teaching Portuguese at secondary schools. And a year later, while he was teaching there, he met his wife, and she was part of the faculty too. And so they ended up getting married, and then later on in life, they ended up having 5 children. And eventually, a couple years later, in 1946, he became the director of the Department of Education and Culture of the Social Services. And so he was the head of that. And then a couple years later, he became the director of the Department of Cultural Extension of Recife University. And so up until 1964, he was part of like all these different educational movements, and they were to deal with massive like illiteracy. He wanted to help people to learn how to read, and he was doing that for a while up until 1964, because then there was like this military coup, which were like people that would like overthrow the government in like a violent, illegal type of way, and they didn't like what he was doing, so they threw him into prison, and he was imprisoned for about 70 days, and then he was exiled in Bolivia, and then he ended up moving to Chile, and he stayed there for the next 5 years. And while he was there, he worked with like this group. It was called the Christian Democratic Agrarian Movement, and he also worked with the Food and Agricultural Organization for the United Nations. And he did that for a while, and he did that because they actually listened to like his teaching methods, and they supported what he thought. And so and then in 1968, he ended up writing his most famous book, and it's called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's widely used today, and it's like referred to all the time. And then in 1979, this was 15 years after he was exiled, so he returned to Brazil, and then he joined the Workers' Party in Sao Paulo, and then he ended up being a part of like this huge adult literacy project, and he was a part of that for 6 years. And then in 1988, he was appointed the Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo, and then eventually he ended up passing away of heart failure in 1997. So moving on to his contributions, so he contributed his like meaningful insight and his vision for education as a whole, and which was focused on learning, creative learning, and freedom. And he came up with this thing called the problem prosing concept, problem posing concept, and it's basically just where he supported like communication between teachers and students, where there was like dialogue and back and forth conversation and questioning and receiving answers, instead of just having the student sit down and the teacher unload all of this information onto the student. It's just more connected that way, so then they can understand better. And he thought that if there wasn't any communication or dialogue, that it would like overall like oppress society. And so that was like his viewpoint. And then he was also considered like influential because of this emphasis on dialogue, and because of his concern for the oppressed, and because of the educational like programs that he was a part of for like adult illiteracy and things like that. So his contribution also was that he left his mark on like the progressive thinking and progressive practices and things that were like social life and progressive thinking towards gaining knowledge and towards learning and overall just an education. And so he was popular among like educators all over the world because of his emphasis on dialogue, and many teachers ended up putting that into practice. And he was also known for his programs that he helped to create that helped people learn how to read and write. So there's one quote that I really, really liked by him, and it says, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And so I really like this because he's talking about how, like either education either functions this way or that way, and he's so supportive of using education as a form of like freedom, and how we should all be like liberal in that, and I really like that. So how he has impacted me is that he's helped me to think that education should be more of a practice of freedom and not of oppression, and he's helped me to understand like my moral and ethical responsibilities as a future teacher, and how I should act and communicate with the students that I'll have. And he's made me want to connect more and being like a human, like involved in like liberation and things like that. Human liberation is what he called it, and just being more involved in that and involved in like the dialogue concepts. And one thing that I really liked is that his idea that liberating education provides like freedom and the capacity for people to choose what they want to do and with their lives, and not having to be oppressed. And so I really like that, and so that's what I really took from this project.